Hi everyone, welcome to this video. In this video, we'll be seeing what AWS VPC endpoints are, what is their purpose. We'll see there are different types of endpoints like gateway endpoint and interface endpoint. So we'll cover these as well. First, we'll cover some theoretical part and then we'll go into demo. We'll create some endpoint and we'll see how it works and how we can configure that. So start this video. So what is a VPC endpoint? So basically in AWS, we in VPC we can create two types of subnet. One is private subnet and public subnet. A public subnet has internet gateway attached to it. So in that case, the instances which are created in public subnet can access internet and from outside also it can accept some connections. But if we want our private subnet to talk to some other services privately, then how we can achieve this thing? So the solution for this thing is VPC endpoint. So it allows our private subnet instances to connect privately to AWS supported services. So basically the traffic does not leave the Amazon network. It stays within the Amazon network and it connects to the AWS services. So this is powered by AWS Private Link. So behind the scene, VPC endpoints use AWS Private Link. So this is one of the offering I would say from AWS or a configuration. So it uses that. And VPC endpoint are a virtual devices that can horizontally scale and these are highly available. So in order to connect to outside services, we do not need any NAT gateway or internet gateway or VPN connection. Everything is done by VPC endpoints. Also on top of it, we do not need to have a public IP associated with the instances. So with the private IP itself, we can communicate to the AWS services. And as I said, traffic does not leave the Amazon network. So in this case, the traffic stays between or within the Amazon network. Suppose you are trying to access S3 bucket in normal scenario. So what happens is that when you are connecting to S3, traffic goes via internet. But with a VPC endpoint, the traffic does not leave Amazon network. It stays within the network. So there are two types of endpoint, interface endpoint and gateway endpoints. So I'll be covering these one by one and then we'll be creating these as well in the demo. So what is a interface endpoint? So first of all, this type of endpoint uses AWS private link to allow the connectivity. Secondly, it allows connectivity to such as AWS managed services, services hosted by other AWS customer and partner in their own VPCs. And it is a collection of one or more ENIs with a private IP addresses. So when we create interface endpoint, it uses the private IP address for communication purpose and it also has security groups attached to it, and via security group we can decide the traffic flow or we can add our respective other security group from which we want to communicate. And there are a lot of services which uses interface endpoint. So some of the services such as Amazon Aurora, CloudTrail, CloudFormation, EC2, etc. Next is gateway endpoint. So it is little bit different in a way it works. So first of all, it uses VPC route table for the communication and it targets specific IP routes in an VPC route table in the form of prefix list. So interface endpoint works on the basis of private address or ENIs, I would say. But gateway endpoint uses VPC route table for the traffic routing. And most importantly, it is not using AWS private link, but interface endpoint uses AWS private link. And it does not allow access from on-premises network, from peered VPC in other region or through a transit gateway. So it does not allow any of these communication like other peered VPCs in other region or transit gateway. And in order, if you want this type of communication to be enabled, then you have to go for interface endpoint. So there are only two services which allows gateway endpoint is that S3 and DynamoDB. But S3 allows both type of endpoint, gateway and interface endpoint as well. So there are certain differences between AWS gateway endpoint and the interface endpoint. First of all, in both cases, I would say traffic remains on the AWS network. It does not leave the AWS network. Because if we are using services such as internet gateway or NAT gateway, in those cases traffic leaves the network. But in this case, we want our private subnet to communicate to some services. So we are using endpoint because traffic does not leave the network. Gateway endpoint uses S3 public IP addresses. Interface endpoint uses private IP addresses from your VPC to access S3. Gateway endpoint uses same Amazon S3 DNS, but interface endpoint requires endpoint specific Amazon S3 DNS name. Gateway endpoint does not allow any access from on-premises or from other AWS region, but interface endpoint allows access from on-premises, and it allows access from a VPC in another region by VPC peering or transit gateway. So I have done detailed video on VPC peering and transit gateway as well. I'll attach a link to those. Gateway endpoints are not built, whereas interface endpoints are built. So here is a quick design that shows the placement of both endpoint and how it is used. So if you see, we have two subnets being created. We have a VPC and there are EC2 instances in each subnet. So in order to talk via interface endpoint, we create one elastic network interface in the same subnet as our instances are. And these gateway type endpoint that is mainly offered for S3 and DynamoDB are placed at the subnet VPC level, and it is using the route table for communication. So that is another major difference. So as you can see, there are a lot of interface endpoint services available like SQS and SNS, CloudWatch, CodeBuild. But for gateway endpoint, we have only two services, that is S3 and DynamoDB. To the AWS console and we'll create endpoint for gateway and interface type both, and we'll see how we can configure those and how it can be used. So this is the AWS console, and currently I'm in the VPC dashboard. So here you can see I have already created one custom VPC. So I'll be creating all my resources in this VPC only. So if you scroll down here, you can see there is an endpoint option. So from here we can create endpoint. So for this video, I have already created one VPC. I have created two subnet. That is, one is private subnet and another is public subnet. So if I just quickly show you my subnets. So I have created two subnets here, and I have created two EC2 instances, one in each subnet, just to for demonstration purpose. These two. And if you want to see how we can create a new VPC and some subnet and EC2 instances, then I've already done a video for that. I'll attach link for that as well. You can go through it. So let's create first the gateway type endpoint because S3 offers both endpoint. So I'll create the S3 gateway endpoint first. My S3 gateway endpoint. So as you can see, there are both options available. I'll first create S3 gateway endpoint. I'll select my custom VPC. So there are two route table available, one for each subnet. So I need to create this S3 endpoint in my private route because I want my private instances to talk to S3 privately. So here you can attach some policies. I'll just create the endpoint now. So it is available. So I'll just show you the route table once because when we create an endpoint, it automatically adds a route. So this is a new route that is being added automatically as soon as we create the endpoint. And as you can see, this is using the private route table for communication. Okay, now I'll be connecting to my public instance first, and from there I'll be connecting to my private instance, and then I'll try to access the S3 bucket. So I already have some S3 buckets being created. So I'll try to list them or run some other commands. So I have 3 buckets already in my account. Let's wait for this instance to up. Yeah. So I'll connect to my public instance first, and from there I'll connect to my private instance. So this is my public instance, and now from here I'll be connecting to my private instance. For that I need the private IP. So I have already copied my keys to this instance. So I'll just connect such. So right now I am inside my private instance. So if I just try to do AWS S3 LS, so you can see I'm able to list all my bucket, and currently it is using the endpoint. So I'll just quickly delete or dissociate my endpoint from my VPC, my private route table. So if I just go to endpoints, manage route table, and I'll remove my private route table from here. This is just to demonstrate that it is using the endpoint for communication. So I've removed my private route table, and I'll again try to run the same command. So you can see it is not working as of now. And again I'll attach my private route table to this. See, now the output came. So it is using the gateway endpoint for communication. And now the second type of endpoint is the interface endpoint, and that uses ENIs. So I'll create that now. This time I am creating an interface endpoint. I need to select my VPC because it is created inside the VPC and subnet. So here I'll need to select my subnet. So I'm creating in my private subnet. This is my private subnet, and I'm attaching default security group to this. Okay, so this is being, it is in pending state, but in between I'll just quickly remove my route table from this so that we are sure that we are using the interface endpoint. So here I'll just show you, it is created inside the subnet, and it is having ENIs. So it is taking the IP from my private subnet. It has security group attached to it. So if I just open this, so there are some DNS names available. So because we'll be connecting via this, so we need this name. Let me try to run this command. It should not work because I'm just testing whether the gateway endpoint is removed or properly or not. So it is not working. Now in order to connect via the interface endpoint, we have to use additional argument, and we have to give endpoint DNS. So this is thing I picked from console. So currently update is in progress. So let's wait for this to complete. Let me check the status. So it is still in pending state. So let's wait for this to complete. So the endpoints are available now. So let's try to connect to it. So it is not working as of now. So there is one last thing that is pending, is that we need to check the security groups, because endpoint uses security groups based communication. We have to see security group for the instance and also for the endpoint. So first let's check the security group for instance. So for outbound it is open. So I think that is fine. It is all traffic is open. And now let's see the endpoint security group. So we attach default security group to it. So it should allow inbound connection basically. So it is allowing all traffic. Yeah, but the source is the default security group as well. So we need to add one route. So for now we can allow all traffic, and I can add the security group. So what is the security group for EC2 instance? It is, so I can add the security group. So let's see how it is now. So now we got the output. So see, this is one important step. I think you should remember that security groups are very much important, and it should allow the inbound connection. So that's all for this video. Thank you. So thanks for watching this video. If you like this content, then please do like, share and subscribe this channel. And if you want me to make some video on any particular topic, then please do mention that in the comment section. I'll definitely make a video for that.